I stared at the message on my phone for a long moment, reading it again and again until the words finally settled in my chest. Apologize properly and I'll consider taking you back. The nerve of it almost made me laugh. Almost. This was coming from the same man who had walked out of our marriage 2 months earlier without hesitation, without remorse, without even pretending to look back. He had left like someone stepping out of a room they were bored with, certain they could return whenever they felt like it. I was sitting on the couch in my new apartment, a place I had rented after he left. It was small, quiet, and still smelled faintly of fresh paint and cardboard boxes. The evening light slipped through the blinds, drawing long shadows across the hardwood floor. Once, that silence would have terrified me. Now, it felt like freedom. My name is Adison. I'm 35 years old. And 2 months ago, my husband of 7 years announced over breakfast that he was leaving me for his ex-girlfriend. He did it on a Tuesday morning, while chewing toast, like he was casually mentioning a change in his routine. No build-up. No warning. Just a simple statement delivered between sips of coffee. I remember holding my mug, watching the steam rise as it went cold in my hands, trying to understand how my life was ending while he continued eating as if nothing monumental had just happened. Her name was Celeste. Someone he had dated briefly in college. Someone he apparently never fully let go of, even while building a life with me. At the time, I couldn't even cry. I just sat there, nodding faintly, while my mind scrambled to keep up. He talked about how this felt right, how he needed to be honest, how it wasn't anyone's fault. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't ask if we could talk. He didn't suggest counseling or time or space. He had already decided. I was just being informed. We met years ago at a networking event in Portland. I was 26, working as an accountant at a small downtown firm, comfortable with my routines and my quiet independence. He was 28, confident, charming, already climbing the ladder at Ironwood Forge. He knew how to talk to people, how to make them feel seen. At least in the beginning. I fell fast. Too fast. We were married within 18 months, and at the time it felt romantic, inevitable, like something that was meant to happen. Looking back now, I can see how many things I ignored. The way my opinions were brushed aside in public. The jokes that landed just a little too close to criticism. The slow, subtle erosion of my confidence until I found myself second-guessing my thoughts before I ever spoke them out loud. I told myself this was normal. That marriage required compromise. That love meant adjusting. That if I just tried harder, if I became more agreeable, more understanding, more patient, things would feel balanced again. They never did. When he left, everyone expected me to break. Friends checked in cautiously, my mother hovered, coworkers spoke to me in soft voices like I was made of glass. I expected to collapse too. Instead, something unexpected happened. After the shock faded, after the sleepless nights and the ugly crying and the overwhelming sense that I had failed at something fundamental, I felt something else creeping in. Relief. The pressure was gone. The constant monitoring of his moods. The mental gymnastics of trying to anticipate what version of him I would get each day. The exhausting effort of shrinking myself so he could feel bigger. The quiet in my apartment wasn't loneliness. It was peace. And now, suddenly, he wanted me to apologize. I set my phone down on the coffee table and leaned back against the cushions, letting out a short, humorless laugh. Apologize for what? For not begging? For not collapsing? For surviving without him? He hadn't specified. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. He wanted reassurance that he still mattered, that he still held power, that I was still waiting in some emotional holding pattern for him to return if and when he felt like it. What he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that his absence hadn't destroyed me. It had woken me up. For the first time in years, I was discovering who I was without him hovering in the background. I was reconnecting with friends I'd quietly drifted away from. I was revisiting interests I'd abandoned because they didn't align with his priorities. I was building a life that belonged to me. The woman who would have panicked at that message, who would have rushed to respond, explaining herself, apologizing for existing, was gone. I picked up my phone again, read the message one last time, then turned it off completely and placed it face down on the table. And I went to bed. No response. No explanation. Let him wait. Lying there in the dark, I felt something shift inside me. It was subtle, almost fragile, but it was there. A realization that I deserved more than emotional crumbs. That I had spent years apologizing for being myself. And that I was done. I didn't know yet how much my life was about to change. I didn't know what was coming. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was finished begging for love from someone who had never truly valued me. Looking back, our marriage had always been unbalanced. I just didn't have the language for it then. I had grown up watching my mother accommodate my father in every way, absorbing the quiet lesson that love meant adapting yourself to someone else's comfort. Without realizing it, I had recreated that dynamic. He thrived at work, moving steadily upward through confidence and relentless self-promotion. He talked endlessly about his achievements, his frustrations, the recognition he deserved. I listened. I supported. I organized. I made space. When I spoke about my work, the conversation rarely lingered. When I succeeded, it was minimized. When I struggled, it was inconvenient. Still, I stayed. I made myself smaller. I told myself this was partnership. The truth didn't fully land until he left and I finally had space to breathe. The affair with Celeste had been going on for months. Innocent messages at first, he said. Then late-night conversations. Then plans. By the time he told me, he had already moved on emotionally. I was just catching up. What hurt wasn't only the betrayal. It was realizing how much of myself I had given to someone who never intended to meet me halfway. I started therapy. I asked hard questions. I learned that loving someone doesn't require disappearing. And slowly, piece by piece, I began rebuilding myself. 3 weeks after his unanswered message, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. And everything began to change. The phone buzzed again while I stared at it, like it was insisting I stop pretending it wasn't happening. I almost let it go to voicemail. Because that was the version of me I had become after Owen left, cautious, guarded, tired of surprises. But something about the timing, or maybe the tone of my own instincts, made me swipe to answer. Hello? A man's voice came through, steady and polite, the kind of voice that sounded like it had never needed to raise itself to be taken seriously. Hi, is this Adison? Yes, who is this? There was a brief pause, like he was choosing his words carefully. This is Theodore. Theodore Kane. I work with Owen at Ironwood Forge. For a second my stomach dropped, the way it does when an old wound is touched unexpectedly. I had met Theodore only a handful of times, always in those stiff corporate settings where I was expected to smile, shake hands, and fade into the background while Owen performed his confident husband routine. Theodore was Owen's boss, the COO. He had always seemed different from the other executives, quieter, less impressed with himself, with eyes that looked like they actually noticed what was happening in a room instead of just scanning for opportunity. I sat up a little straighter, my heart suddenly beating too loud in the quiet apartment. Hi. Is everything okay? I asked, because my mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. Lawsuits. HR issues. Owen trying to stir something up. Some fresh complication I didn't have energy for. Yes, Theodore said quickly. Nothing like that. I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I hope I'm not intruding. You're fine, I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it yet. He cleared his throat softly. I heard about what happened, about your separation. I didn't want to assume anything, and I know it's not my place, but I felt compelled to check on you. The words hit me strangely. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were gentle. Concern without curiosity, support without pity. It had been a long time since a man spoke to me like that. "That's kind of you," I said slowly. "I'm okay. I mean, as okay as you can be." "I'm glad to hear that," he replied. "I won't take much of your time. I just wanted you to know that if there's anything you need, anything I can do, even if it's just a conversation, I'm here." I didn't know what to say. For a moment, I could only listen to the soft hum on the line and the distant sound of traffic outside my window. We talked for a few minutes after that, lightly, carefully. Weather. Work. The holidays coming up. The kind of polite conversation people use as a bridge so no one has to stare directly at the raw thing underneath. And then, just when I thought he was about to end the call, he said, "Would you be open to meeting for coffee sometime?" My first reaction was suspicion. A reflex. Because after Owen, I had learned that invitations often came with hidden strings. Favors. Expectations. Manipulation disguised as kindness. But Theodore's tone didn't feel like that. There was no confidence that I would say yes, no pressure. Just an offer. "Not as a date," he added quickly, almost like he was worried he'd scared me off. "Truly. Just coffee. I remember talking with you at a couple of company events and thinking you seemed thoughtful. Intelligent. And honestly, I'd been through my own divorce, so I understand the aftermath. If it feels weird, you can say no. I'll completely understand." The fact that he gave me an easy exit made it harder to refuse. Owen never gave me exits. Owen gave me traps. I surprised myself by saying, "Okay. Coffee is fine." We agreed on Saturday afternoon at a small cafe near my apartment, a quiet place with warm lighting and pastries that actually tasted like butter instead of sugar-coated air. After I hung up, I sat there staring at my blank phone screen like it might explain what had just happened. Owen's boss. Calling me. Asking me to meet. It didn't make sense. For the rest of the week, the idea sat in the back of my mind. I kept turning it over, trying to find the angle, the hidden motive. Maybe it was corporate damage control. Maybe Owen had told some dramatic version of the story and Theodore wanted to smooth things over. Maybe Theodore was just curious, another person wanting a front row seat to my humiliation. But then I'd remember his voice. Calm. Respectful. Not hungry for details. Saturday came faster than I expected. I stood in front of my closet longer than I wanted to admit, trying to pick an outfit that didn't scream "I'm trying" and didn't scream "I've given up." I settled on dark jeans, a soft sweater, simple earrings. I put on a little mascara because I wanted to look awake and alive, not like someone still crawling out of heartbreak. When I walked into the cafe, I spotted him immediately. Theodore was sitting in the corner with 2 coffees already on the table, like he had guessed what I would order. He stood when he saw me, not dramatically, just naturally, and pulled out the chair for me with the kind of old-fashioned politeness that made my chest tighten in a weird, uncomfortable way. Because it reminded me how rarely I had been treated with care. "Adison," he said with a small smile. "Thank you for coming." "Thanks for inviting me," I replied, still unsure what lane we were in. We sat, and at first the conversation was light. But it didn't stay shallow for long, because Theodore asked real questions. Not the kind people ask to fill air, but the kind that actually require thought. He asked about my work, not in a "what do you do" way, but in a "do you like it" way. He asked what I wanted, not what I was settling for. He asked what my life looked like before I became someone's wife. And to my own surprise, I answered. I told him about being content in my accounting job, about the quiet pride I took in being good at something steady and reliable. I told him how much I used to love hiking around Oregon, how I stopped going because Owen always complained about it. I told him about the friends I had lost because my marriage became my whole life. The words spilled out faster than I expected, like they had been waiting for someone to listen without interrupting or correcting me. Theodore didn't lean in with gossip. He didn't ask what Owen did wrong. He didn't even say Owen's name. He just let me speak, and when I finished, he nodded slowly like he was taking me seriously. Then he told me a little about himself. He was 42. Divorced 3 years. No kids. He talked about the divorce without bitterness, which startled me. Not because I thought he should be bitter, but because most people use their ex as a villain so they can feel like the hero. Theodore didn't do that. He spoke like someone who had actually looked at his own role, taken accountability, learned something painful, and survived it. "I'm not perfect," he said at one point, his fingers loosely around his coffee cup. "But I am trying to be better than who I was." It was such a simple sentence, and it hit me harder than any romantic line ever could. Because Owen had never tried to be better. Owen just expected me to adjust. We talked for nearly 3 hours. At some point, I realized I had laughed. Not that short polite laugh women do when they want to keep the peace, but real laughter that surprises you because it comes from someplace you forgot existed. When we finally stood to leave, the sun was already sinking, washing the street in orange light. Theodore walked me to my car like it was the most natural thing in the world. He didn't touch me, didn't try to create a moment, didn't test boundaries. He simply stood beside me and said, "I enjoyed today. If you'd like to do it again sometime, I'd be glad." I heard myself say, "Yeah. I'd like that." Driving home, I kept replaying the afternoon in my head. Not because I was swooning, but because I was confused by how safe I felt. Safe was not a word I associated with men anymore. Not after Owen. Over the next few weeks, Theodore and I met again. Dinner once. A walk in the park another time. Small conversations that kept stretching longer than planned. It was never rushed. He never asked for more than I offered. And each time, I found myself telling him things I hadn't even said out loud to my therapist yet. I told him about the way Owen dismissed me in front of people and then acted like I was too sensitive if I reacted. I told him about how I started apologizing for everything, even things that weren't my fault, just to avoid conflict. I told him about the way my confidence slowly eroded until I couldn't remember what it felt like to trust my own instincts. Theodore listened, and he didn't say, "Well, you should have left." He didn't say, "Why did you stay?" He didn't make me feel foolish for believing in my marriage. He just said, "I'm sorry you went through that." Sometimes, those 6 words are more healing than an entire lecture. Meanwhile, Owen kept trying to pull me back into his orbit. New numbers. Emails. Messages from his mother that pretended to be concern but felt like surveillance. And I started hearing things through mutual friends. That Celeste wasn't as perfect as Owen had convinced himself she would be. That they were fighting. That the dreamy reunion had turned into 2 adults trying to force a college fantasy into real life. A part of me should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt tired. Like I was watching someone else's storm from a distance and realizing I didn't live there anymore. Then one evening, about 6 weeks after that first coffee, Theodore came over. We ate Thai food on my couch, the containers spread across the coffee table, the TV playing something neither of us cared about. The room felt warm, lived in, comfortable. And Theodore turned to me with an expression that made my stomach flip. "Adison," he said quietly, "I need to be honest with you." My body tensed automatically, because honesty had always been the prelude to hurt. "I don't want to pressure you," he continued, voice steady. "But my feelings have changed. They've grown. And I can't pretend they haven't." I held my breath. "I'm falling for you," he said, simply. "And I understand if you're not ready to hear that. I understand if it's too soon. I just didn't want to keep lying by omission." The room went very still. I looked at him, at the calm in his eyes, at the patience in his posture, at the way he wasn't reaching for me or trying to claim me. He was just offering the truth and letting me decide what to do with it. And something inside me, something that had been guarded and bruised for so long, stirred awake. I didn't say the words back. Not yet. I wasn't ready to promise what my heart was still learning to trust. But I did say, I want to get there. And the way his face softened in response, the way he reached for my hand and held it like it was something precious, made my throat burn. "I'll wait," he said. "As long as you need." That night, after he left, I stood at my sink washing dishes and cried again. Not because I was broken, but because I could feel the old fear fighting the new hope, and I didn't know which one would win. What I did know was this. Owen wasn't finished trying to control the story. And he was about to show up in a way I couldn't ignore. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, like dawn breaking while you're still half asleep. One morning I woke up and realized that Owen wasn't the first thought in my head anymore. Not his betrayal, not his absence, not the unanswered questions that had haunted me for weeks. Instead, my mind went to Theodore. To the way he smiled when he listened. To the warmth in his voice when he said my name. To the steadiness that had begun to anchor me in a way I didn't even know I'd been craving. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. I had spent so long bracing myself for loss that the presence of something good felt almost dangerous. Happiness. Connection. Trust. Those things didn't feel safe yet. They felt like risks. And I had been burned badly enough that my instincts were still whispering warnings, reminding me how easily things could fall apart. But even with that fear, I couldn't deny what was happening. I felt lighter. More present. Less trapped in my own head. Owen, on the other hand, was unraveling. His silence after that first unanswered text didn't last. It never does with men like him. The entitlement eventually demands acknowledgement. When texts didn't work, he started leaving voicemails. I deleted most of them without listening, but one slipped through when I wasn't paying attention. His voice was thick with alcohol and frustration, swinging wildly between wounded and accusatory. He said he didn't understand why I was doing this to him. He said I was being cruel. He said we needed to talk like adults. He said he deserved closure. He said I owed him that much after everything we'd shared. The word owed landed in my chest like a slap. I blocked his number after that. Then his mother called. Her voice was sweet, overly concerned, asking how I was holding up, saying she just wanted to make sure I was okay. But beneath the politeness was a familiar undercurrent, one I'd felt for years. She wanted information. She wanted reassurance that her son was still the center of my world. She wanted to know whether I was still waiting. I told her I was fine and ended the call. Through mutual friends, the story reached me in fragments. Owen and Celeste were fighting. A lot. The fantasy reunion was cracking under the weight of reality. She wasn't as accommodating as he remembered. She didn't exist to orbit his moods. She had opinions. Needs. Expectations. The irony was sharp. He had left a woman who bent herself into knots trying to please him, only to discover that the version of Celeste he had built in his head didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt detached. Like I was watching a movie I used to star in, recognizing the patterns without wanting to step back into the scene. Theodore remained steady through all of it. We settled into an easy rhythm. Seeing each other a few times a week. Texts in the morning. Check-ins during the day. Long conversations in the evenings that stretched until neither of us noticed the time. He never pushed. Never rushed. Never made me feel like I had to be healed already. I told him things I had never told Owen. About the way I'd learned to apologize for existing. About the constant self-doubt. About how I had lost my sense of self so slowly that I hadn't noticed until there was almost nothing left. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't interrupt with solutions. He just listened. One evening, about 6 weeks after our first coffee, we were sitting on my couch, half watching a movie that neither of us was paying attention to. Takeout containers were scattered across the table. The room felt warm and comfortable in a way that made my chest ache. Theodore turned toward me, his expression serious but calm. "There's something I need to say," he began. "And I want you to know there's no expectation attached to it." My body tensed instinctively. Old reflexes. "I'm falling in love with you," he said. The words didn't crash into me. They settled. Quietly. Honestly. Without pressure. "I don't need you to say it back," he continued. "I know your life is complicated right now. I know you're healing. I just didn't want to hide what I'm feeling." I stared at him, heart pounding, not with fear, but with recognition. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't control. This was someone offering truth and trusting me with it. "I'm not ready to say it yet," I admitted. "But I want to be. You've changed something in me. The way I see myself. The way I think about what's possible." He reached for my hand, holding it gently. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "We have time." That night, after he left, I cried while washing dishes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming collision of hope and fear. Trust had been used against me before. I was terrified of letting it happen again. But I was more terrified of closing myself off completely and missing something real. That was the night I realized Owen no longer held the power to define my future. And that realization came just in time, because he was about to force his way back into my life in the most dramatic way possible. The night it happened started like any other. Theodore came over after work, bringing flowers and a bottle of wine. We cooked dinner together, moving around my small kitchen like it was the most natural thing in the world. The domestic ease of it caught me off guard. There was no tension. No walking on eggshells. No feeling like I was performing a role. After dinner, we sat on the couch. Theodore put his arm around me, pulling me gently closer. I rested my head against his shoulder and felt something give way inside me. The last wall. The final hesitation. I turned to face him. The kiss started slowly, cautiously, like a question. The second one was the answer. He pulled back just enough to look at me. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Is this what you want?" I kissed him again instead of answering. We moved to the bedroom without rushing, without urgency, taking our time with each other in a way that felt intentional and safe. For the first time in years, I wasn't disconnected from my own body. I wasn't worrying about whether I was doing it right or meeting someone else's expectations. I was present. Fully. Afterward, we lay together in the quiet, my head resting on his chest, his fingers tracing slow patterns along my back. I felt peaceful. Truly peaceful. And that was when the pounding started. Hard. Aggressive. Insistent. We both froze. Theodore sat up, confusion flickering across his face. "Are you expecting someone?" I shook my head, already feeling dread crawl up my spine. Then I heard the voice. Owen. Slurred. Loud. Angry. He was shouting through the door, demanding that I open it. Saying he'd tried calling. Tried texting. Tried everything. Accusing me of being unreasonable. Insisting that we needed to talk. Claiming it was his right as my husband. I looked at Theodore. He didn't move toward the door. Didn't take control. He just asked quietly, "What do you want to do?" The choice was mine. Something hardened inside me. I got out of bed and slipped on a robe, my movements steady. I asked Theodore to stay back for a moment. I wanted to open the door myself. I wanted Owen to see me. Not afraid. Not broken. The pounding continued as I walked down the hallway. Each step felt heavy and liberating at the same time. I unlocked the door and opened it. Owen stood there, flushed, disheveled, smelling strongly of alcohol. His eyes flicked over me, taking in my appearance, the robe, the state I was in. Confusion flashed across his face, quickly followed by suspicion. He demanded to know what was going on. Why I looked like that. Whether I was alone. I told him calmly that what happened in my apartment was none of his business. He pushed past me anyway. And that was when everything truly changed. Owen didn't wait for permission. He brushed past me like I was still something he owned, something he could move aside when it suited him. His shoes hit the hardwood floor hard, unsteady, his eyes already scanning the apartment with a frantic intensity. He was looking for proof. For confirmation of the suspicion that had clearly been growing in his mind for weeks. 2 wine glasses on the coffee table. Takeout containers. The soft glow of lamps instead of overhead lights. The unmistakable signs that I hadn't been alone. His jaw tightened as he turned back toward me, accusation already rising in his throat. I could see it forming, the familiar pattern of outrage and self-righteousness he always used when reality didn't align with his expectations. And then Theodore stepped out of the bedroom. He had taken the time to get dressed. His shirt was buttoned but untucked, his hair slightly rumpled, his presence calm and grounded in a way that immediately shifted the air in the room. He didn't rush. He didn't square up. He simply stood there, meeting Owen's gaze without flinching. The change in Owen was instant and almost shocking. His face drained of color, then flushed deep red. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out at first. He looked like someone who had walked into the wrong reality by mistake and was desperately trying to wake up. Theodore, he finally managed, his voice cracking around the name like it didn't belong in his mouth. He looked from Theodore to me and back again, his mind scrambling to rearrange the story he had been telling himself. In his version, I was alone. Waiting. Suffering. In need of his return. This didn't fit. What the hell is this? He demanded, though the answer was painfully obvious. Theodore spoke before I could, his voice even, controlled, carrying the quiet authority Owen knew well. You need to leave, he said. Not a request. A statement. Owen bristled, humiliation and anger colliding inside him. This is my wife's apartment, he snapped. I have every right to be here. Theodore didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He simply held his ground. You gave up that right when you chose to walk away from your marriage, he said. What happens here now is not your concern. The words landed like a blow. I watched Owen's confidence fracture in real time. This was the man whose approval he had chased for years, whose respect he had carefully cultivated, standing in front of him and calmly dismantling the illusion he had built around himself. Owen turned to me then, desperation creeping into his expression. Is this why you've been ignoring me? He asked. How long has this been going on? Were you cheating on me? No, I said, steady and clear. Nothing happened until after you left. But I stopped waiting for you the moment you walked out. His face twisted, pain breaking through the entitlement. Did you ever even love me? He asked, his voice cracking. The question hit harder than I expected, not because I doubted myself, but because I saw the truth of his confusion. He genuinely believed I would always be there, that my love was permanent and unconditional no matter how he treated it. I loved you, I said quietly. But loving you cost me myself. And I'm not willing to do that again. He looked like he wanted to argue, to rage, to reclaim control. But the weight of the situation pressed down on him. This wasn't a fight he could win. Not here. Not now. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. His shoulders were slumped, his movements heavy. At the threshold, he paused, looking back at me one last time. There was something in his eyes that might have been regret, or maybe just the realization that he had miscalculated everything. Then he left. The door closed softly behind him. The silence that followed was thick and ringing, like the aftermath of an explosion. Theodore crossed the room and wrapped his arms around me, holding me without saying anything. I pressed my face into his chest, my body finally releasing the tension I had been holding. When I pulled back, I searched his face. Are you okay? I asked. Is this going to cause problems for you at work? He considered for a moment, then gave a small, confident smile. Owen's position isn't as secure as he thinks, he said. And I've been planning changes for a while. This doesn't change anything I can't handle. I believed him. What mattered most was that he hadn't hidden. He hadn't backed away. He hadn't made me feel like something inconvenient or embarrassing. He had stood beside me openly. That night, we talked for hours. About my marriage. About his divorce. About the ways we had both learned hard lessons about love and power and self-worth. We didn't pretend we were unscarred. We didn't rush to rewrite our pasts. We simply acknowledged them and chose to move forward together. The ripples from that night spread quickly. Owen couldn't keep quiet. Within days, rumors were circulating. Some people believed I had betrayed him. Others saw through the story and recognized that he was facing the consequences of his own choices. Messages came in from acquaintances, coworkers, distant friends. I ignored most of them. The divorce proceedings continued, and Owen's behavior only strengthened my case. My lawyer assured me that his volatility worked against him, not in his favor. Theodore and I stopped hiding. We went to events together. Met friends. Shared our relationship openly. And something unexpected happened. People noticed how different I was. They said I seemed lighter. More confident. More present. They said I looked happy. 6 months later, my divorce was finalized. Clean. Final. I walked out of that chapter with my dignity intact and no desire to look back. Theodore proposed on a quiet evening at home. No spectacle. No audience. Just the two of us and a simple question that I answered without hesitation. As for Owen, his relationship with Celeste imploded shortly after that night. His position at Ironwood Forge was eliminated during a restructuring Theodore had been planning long before. He landed on his feet eventually, but not where he thought he would. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I simply moved on. Standing in my living room one evening, the ring on my finger catching the light, I understood something that changed everything. The greatest revenge wasn't watching Owen lose. It was realizing I no longer needed him to be sorry. Life didn't transform overnight after Owen walked out of my apartment. There was no dramatic montage where everything suddenly made sense and every scar disappeared. Healing doesn't work like that. It's quieter. Slower. It happens in small, almost unnoticeable ways until one day you look back and realize how far you've come. In the days after that confrontation, my emotions came in waves. Some mornings I woke up feeling powerful, grounded in the knowledge that I had finally stood my ground. Other mornings, I felt hollow, exhausted from the emotional weight of everything that had surfaced. 7 years of buried resentment doesn't evaporate just because the truth finally speaks out loud. Theodore never rushed me through any of it. He checked in, but he didn't hover. He listened when I needed to talk and sat in silence with me when words felt like too much effort. He never tried to turn my pain into a lesson or a stepping stone for our relationship. He understood that healing wasn't something he could accelerate or control, and that respect only deepened my trust in him. Owen, on the other hand, spiraled. I heard about it through the same quiet channels people use when they don't want to be directly involved. Mutual acquaintances. Old friends who didn't know which side to take but couldn't help passing along information. His relationship with Celeste collapsed in dramatic fashion. The fantasy he had chased shattered under the weight of reality, and once it did, he had nowhere to place the blame except outward. He tried calling again from new numbers. He sent long emails that swung between apology and accusation, regret and resentment. He said he had made a mistake. He said he missed me. He said he never thought I'd actually move on. That last sentence stayed with me. He never thought I would move on. It was never about love. It was about permanence. About possession. About the certainty that I would always be there, even if he left. I didn't respond. The divorce proceedings dragged on, not because of complications, but because Owen resisted every step that made our separation final. It was as if signing those papers meant admitting he had lost something he could never get back. I let my lawyer handle it. I was done negotiating my worth. Meanwhile, my own life kept unfolding. I took on new projects at work. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because I finally had the mental space to care again. I started hiking on weekends, alone at first, then sometimes with Theodore. I filled my apartment with plants, with books, with pieces of myself I had neglected for years. I laughed more. I slept better. I stopped apologizing when I spoke. Theodore and I grew closer in ways that felt steady rather than intoxicating. There were no emotional roller coasters. No sudden disappearances. No games. Just consistency. One evening, as we sat together on my couch, I caught myself watching him instead of the movie. The way he leaned forward when something interested him. The way he smiled with his whole face. The way he listened, not just to words, but to pauses. It hit me then how deeply different this felt from anything I had known before. With Owen, love had always been conditional. Earned. Revocable. With Theodore, it felt like a choice. One we kept making, quietly, every day. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday afternoon. I signed the last document in a small conference room with neutral art on the walls and a stale smell of coffee in the air. When it was done, my lawyer shook my hand and said congratulations. The word felt strange in that context, but not wrong. I walked out into the sunlight and sat in my car for a long moment before turning the key. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. Like a chapter had closed properly instead of being ripped out mid-sentence. That evening, Theodore came over with takeout and a bottle of wine. We didn't make it a celebration. We just sat together, talking about nothing and everything. At one point, he reached for my hand and said he was proud of me. Not for surviving. For choosing myself. A few weeks later, he proposed. It wasn't elaborate. No crowd. No performance. Just the two of us in my living room, the same space where I had once felt trapped and afraid, now transformed into something safe and warm. He asked simply, honestly, without pressure. And I said yes without hesitation. Planning the wedding felt surreal. Not because I was scared, but because this time I wasn't trying to fit myself into someone else's expectations. We planned something small. Intentional. Surrounded by people who genuinely wished us well. As for Owen, his life continued to unravel in quieter ways. He lost his position at Ironwood Forge during a restructuring that had nothing to do with spite and everything to do with performance. He bounced between jobs that didn't match his ambition. Friends drifted away as his bitterness grew heavier. I felt a distant sadness for him, the kind you feel for someone who refuses to learn the lesson life keeps offering. But I didn't feel responsible. Standing in my living room one night, the engagement ring catching the light, I thought back to that text message that started everything. The demand for an apology. The assumption that I would wait. I smiled to myself. The greatest revenge wasn't watching him fall. It was realizing that his opinion no longer mattered at all. As the weeks turned into months, something subtle but profound settled into my life. The chaos that had once defined my emotional landscape faded into the background, replaced by a steadiness I had never known before. Not the kind that comes from suppressing pain or pretending everything is fine, but the kind that grows when you finally stop fighting yourself. Being with Theodore didn't erase my past. It didn't magically undo 7 years of conditioning or the habits I had developed to survive my marriage. There were still moments when I flinched at raised voices, when I instinctively braced for criticism that never came, when I caught myself over-explaining simple choices. The difference was that now, those moments were met with patience instead of judgment. Theodore noticed everything. Not in a watchful, controlling way, but in the quiet way of someone who genuinely cared. When I apologized unnecessarily, he gently asked why. When I hesitated to express an opinion, he waited without interrupting. He gave me space to relearn myself at my own pace. That was the greatest gift he gave me. Space without abandonment. Meanwhile, Owen continued orbiting the wreckage of his own choices. He tried reaching out again after the divorce papers were signed, this time with a tone that was almost humble. Almost. He said he hoped we could be civil one day. That he missed our friendship. That he wished things hadn't ended the way they did. I read the message once and deleted it. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was finished. The absence of emotion surprised me more than anything else. For so long, Owen had been a gravitational force in my life, pulling my thoughts back to him even when I didn't want them to go. Now, he felt distant. Small. Like a story I used to tell but no longer needed. People around me noticed the change. Paige told me one afternoon over lunch that I seemed taller somehow, even though I obviously wasn't. She said I took up space differently now. I spoke without shrinking my voice. I laughed without checking whether it was appropriate. I existed without apology. That comment stayed with me. I had spent years making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. And now that I had stopped, everything felt lighter. Wedding planning brought its own emotions. Not anxiety, surprisingly, but reflection. I thought often about the woman I had been when I first walked down an aisle, nervous and hopeful and unaware of how much of herself she was about to give away. This time felt different. This time, I wasn't asking someone to complete me. I was choosing someone to walk beside me. Theodore never once tried to control the process. He cared about the details because they mattered to me, not because he needed things to be a certain way. When we disagreed, we talked. When one of us needed space, the other respected it. There were no power struggles. No silent treatments. No emotional bargaining. Love, I learned, wasn't supposed to feel like endurance. As for Owen, the final unraveling came quietly. No dramatic confrontation. No public collapse. Just the slow accumulation of consequences. His career stalled. His social circle shrank. The charm that once smoothed everything over stopped working when people realized there was nothing behind it but entitlement. I heard through someone that he had started therapy. I hoped it was true. Not for my sake, but for his. Some lessons arrive too late to save relationships, but not too late to save a person. I didn't reach out. I didn't need closure from him anymore. The closure came from something much simpler. One morning, as I stood in my kitchen making coffee, sunlight spilling across the counter, I realized I felt calm. Not excited. Not anxious. Just calm. And for someone who had lived in emotional turbulence for years, that calm felt revolutionary. I had stopped replaying the past. Stopped rewriting conversations in my head. Stopped wondering what I could have done differently. I had accepted that loving someone doesn't obligate you to lose yourself, and that walking away from what diminishes you is not failure. It's courage. That understanding didn't come with fireworks. It arrived quietly, like peace often does. And it stayed. The morning I woke up on my wedding day, the first thing I noticed was how quiet my mind felt. Not empty, not numb, just calm. The kind of calm that comes when you know you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and warm, and for a moment I stayed still, letting the feeling settle in my chest. Years ago, on another morning like this, my stomach had been tight with nerves. I had been terrified of doing something wrong, of disappointing someone, of not being enough. That version of me felt so distant now that it was hard to believe we shared the same body. This time, I felt grounded. As I got ready, surrounded by a few close friends, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. I didn't just see a woman about to get married. I saw someone who had survived being diminished, who had walked through abandonment, who had chosen herself when it would have been easier to beg for scraps of affection. The ceremony was simple. Honest. Full of people who knew the real me, not the edited version I used to present to keep the peace. When Theodore took my hands and looked at me, there was no doubt in his eyes. No calculation. No sense of ownership. Just respect, love, and choice. That was when it hit me fully. This was what partnership was supposed to feel like. Not a hierarchy. Not a performance. Not a negotiation of worth. Afterward, as the day softened into evening and laughter filled the space around us, I found myself thinking briefly of Owen. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just with clarity. I realized that if he had never left, I might still be shrinking myself to fit inside a life that was slowly suffocating me. I might still be apologizing for needs, silencing opinions, waiting for approval that never came. His decision to walk away had felt like the end of my world at the time, but it was actually the beginning of something far better. That didn't make his actions noble. It didn't erase the pain. But it reframed it. Sometimes the worst thing someone does to you becomes the thing that saves you. I never needed him to regret it. I never needed him to suffer. I never needed an apology. What I needed was distance. Space. A chance to hear my own voice again. And once I did, everything changed. Standing there with my husband, surrounded by warmth and honesty and love that didn't require me to disappear, I understood what real closure felt like. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't watching someone else fall apart. It was peace. It was waking up without dread. It was loving without fear. It was knowing, deep in my bones, that I would never accept less than I deserved again. That was the ending of my old story. And the beginning of a life that finally belonged to me.